You've called yourself lazy so many times it doesn't even sting anymore. It's just the word you use, the explanation you reach for when the day ends and you haven't done what you said you'd do. When the project sits untouched, when the alarm gets snoozed, when you watch yourself choose comfort over progress and feel that quiet, familiar disgust settling in. And the strange thing is, you don't even fight it anymore. You used to. There was a version of you that got angry, that set new alarms, downloaded new apps, made new lists, told yourself that this week was different. But somewhere along the way, you stopped arguing. You just absorbed it. Lazy. That's who I am. That's the shape of me. Have you ever noticed how easily that word became a personality? Not a habit, not a pattern, a permanent feature of who you are. Like eye color or height. Unchosen, unchangeable, just true. But here's what no one ever told you. That word lazy, it isn't a diagnosis. It isn't even close to the truth. It's a story someone handed you at some point, and you've been carrying it ever since. A shortcut explanation that stopped you from ever asking the real question. Why? Not, why can't I just do the thing? That question keeps you stuck. The real question is what is actually happening underneath in the part of you that nobody taught you to look at, because what you've been calling laziness has a different name in psychology. And once you hear it, once you actually understand what's been running in the background this whole time, you won't be able to call yourself lazy again. Not because you'll suddenly have everything figured out, but because you'll finally see it clearly. And clarity is where everything begins to shift. Don't let lazy define you. Subscribe now and uncover the truth behind what's really holding you back. Once you see it clearly, nothing will feel the same again. Carl Jung spent his life looking at the parts of human behavior that people couldn't explain and couldn't fix by simply trying harder. He wasn't interested in motivation. He wasn't interested in discipline tips or habit stacks. He was interested in why. Why intelligent people stay stuck. Why people who desperately want change keep circling back to the same patterns. Why effort alone never seems to be enough. And what he found wasn't laziness. It was something far more specific. Something that lives beneath the surface of how you move through your days, shaping your choices, draining your energy, keeping you in place without you ever seeing it clearly enough to name it. Jung called it psychic energy. And no, not in a mystical sense, in a deeply practical one. He observed that every human being carries a finite amount of psychological energy, the internal resource that drives motivation, decision, emotional regulation, and the capacity to begin, not physical energy, something subtler. The energy it takes to face what you're avoiding. The energy it takes to act before you feel ready. The energy it takes to hold your own expectations without collapsing under them. And here's what almost nobody understands about that energy. It can be depleted by things that have nothing to do with how much you slept or how motivated you feel in theory. It gets spent heavily, invisibly, on suppression, on carrying beliefs about yourself that you absorbed long before you were old enough to examine them, on protecting yourself from something you may not even be consciously aware you're afraid of. Think about what that means for a moment. The person you've been calling lazy, the one who knows what they should do, genuinely wants to do it, and still doesn't, may not be failing because of weakness. They may be failing because they're already exhausted, not from doing, from carrying. And here's the first thing Jung would want you to understand. This didn't start with you. It started long before you had any say in the matter. Most of the psychological patterns that people experience as laziness, the avoidance, the resistance, the inability to begin, the way you can feel completely immobilized by tasks that should feel simple. They don't come from character flaws, they come from conditioning. From environments where action felt unsafe, where trying and failing had consequences, where stillness was actually the more intelligent survival response. A child who grows up in a home where perfectionism is the invisible standard doesn't learn to begin imperfectly. They learn to not begin at all because an incomplete attempt is more painful than no attempt. That lesson doesn't disappear when they become an adult, it just gets renamed, it becomes laziness. A child who grows up in chaos, where effort rarely led to reward because the environment was unpredictable, learns that trying is expensive and returns are uncertain. They don't become lazy, They become rational in a system that punished optimism. That adaptation travels with them into adulthood and keeps operating as though the original conditions never changed. You didn't choose any of this. These were not decisions, they were responses. Intelligent, efficient, survival-level responses to environments and experiences that ask things of you before you had the tools to process them. Your nervous system learned something, and it hasn't been given a reason to unlearn it yet. This is what Jung meant when he mapped the unconscious, not as some exotic, unreachable part of you, but as the accumulated weight of everything you experienced, concluded, and adapted to before you had the language to question it. It runs automatically. It doesn't ask for your permission. It just operates. And one of the ways it operates is by placing a quiet, invisible barrier between you and the things you want to do. Not because it wants to hold you back, because at some level it still believes that staying still is safer than moving forward. There's a specific Jungian concept that maps directly onto this. And once you understand it, you'll start seeing it everywhere. In yourself, in the people closest to you, in the patterns you've been trying to break for years. He called it the shadow, not the dramatic version, not the darkness inside you that you should be afraid of. The shadow in Yan terms is simply the part of you that you learned to hide. The version of you that felt too much, wanted too much, failed too visibly, was too loud or too sensitive or too ambitious for the environment you grew up in, so you pushed it down. You learned to present a version of yourself that was more acceptable, more contained, more manageable. And that act of containing, of suppression, it costs. Here's what almost nobody talks about when they discuss laziness and productivity and discipline. And this is the part that actually changes how you see yourself completely. The energy you spend keeping parts of yourself hidden, the wants, the fears, the grief, the anger, the ambition you were quietly told was arrogance. That energy doesn't disappear, it doesn't sit still. It circulates and it keeps circulating, consuming your psychic resources beneath the surface, leaving less available for the life you're trying to build above it. So when you sit down to work and nothing comes, when you open the document and feel nothing but a vague, sourceless dread, when you know exactly what to do and still can't make yourself start, that is not laziness, that is depletion. That is what it looks and feels like when your available energy is already spoken for, already being used to maintain a version of yourself that was built for survival, not for living. And this is where it gets important, because once you understand that the barrier isn't character, it's circuitry, the question stops being, what is wrong with me, and starts being something far more useful. Something Jung spent decades pointing people toward, something that most people, even the ones who've read about him, never quite reach. Here's what Jung discovered when he followed that question to its end. The problem was never the absence of will. It was the presence of conflict, internal conflict, the kind that runs so quietly beneath the surface of your days that you mistake it for personality. And the first insight, the one that reframes everything that came before it, is this. You are not one self trying and failing. You are multiple parts pulling in different directions simultaneously. And what you experience as laziness is often the result of those parts being at war with each other without you even knowing the war is happening. Think about what that actually looks like in real life. You decide genuinely that you're going to start tomorrow morning early. The intention is real, you feel it. And then tomorrow morning arrives and something happens that has nothing to do with how serious you were. The body gets heavy. The mind finds something else, a reason, a detour, a more comfortable direction, and you watch it happen almost from the outside like you're a passenger in your own morning. That isn't weakness. That is two parts of you making two different calculations at exactly the same moment. One part knows what you need to do. Another part has a different set of information, older information written in an earlier chapter of your life. And that part is making its own decision based on what it learned about safety and risk and what happens when you try and fall short. Jung called this the conflict between the conscious will and the unconscious drive. And here's what matters. The unconscious is not weaker than the conscious. In most people, it is considerably stronger. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because it's been running longer. It's more practiced, it has more void data, and it will almost always win a direct confrontation. This is why willpower doesn't work the way people think it should. You can't overpower a part of you that doesn't know it's in a fight. You can't discipline your way past a system that was built specifically to survive pressure. The part of you that avoids, that stalls, that chooses the easier thing, it isn't irrational. It's operating on a logic you haven't fully examined yet. And until you examine it, you'll keep experiencing the same ceiling. Not because you're not trying hard enough, because you're trying in the wrong direction. The second insight is where this becomes personal, in a way that most people aren't ready for. Jung observed that the things people most persistently avoid are almost never random. Avoidance has a structure, it has a shape, and if you look at your own life, really look without flinching, you'll find that the things you can't seem to start, the projects that sit, the calls you don't make, the work that stays undone, they tend to cluster around a specific kind of stakes. Not all tasks feel equally impossible. You've probably noticed that some things you do easily, almost automatically, without the weight. Other things carry something with them, a pressure, a significance, something underneath the task itself that makes the task feel larger than it is. And that is the tell, because what Jung found, and this is the part that should stop you completely, is that we most reliably avoid the things that matter to us the most. Not the things we don't care about, the things we care about deeply, the creative work, the meaningful project, the relationship conversation that actually needs to happen, the version of your life you actually want. The closer something is to who you really are, the more terrifying it is to try and fail at it. If you write a task on a list and it doesn't matter much, you do it. If you write something on that list that represents something real, something that would confirm you're capable or reveal that you're not, the unconscious has a very different response. It protects you from the test, and it does it so efficiently, so quietly, that all you see from the outside is another wasted afternoon. This is not laziness, this is protection. Misdirected, costly, life-ruining protection, but protection nonetheless. The part of you that keeps you from beginning your most important work is not your enemy. It is an older, frightened version of you doing the only thing it knows how to do. If you're still here, you're already in a different category from most people who clicked this video. Most people get to this point and feel the discomfort and look away. You didn't. That means something. Stay with it. The third insight is the one Jung himself considered the most important, and it's also the most misunderstood. He said, and this is worth sitting with, that what you do not make conscious, you will experience as fate, not as a choice you made, not as a pattern you could have interrupted, as something that simply happened to you again and again in different circumstances, wearing different faces, producing the same outcome. The person who calls themselves lazy and never questions it will keep living inside that story. Not because the story is true, but because an unexamined story operates exactly like truth. It shapes what you attempt, it shapes what you expect, it shapes what you allow yourself to want and how hard you're willing to fight for it before the familiar voice says, see, this is why you don't bother. But when you bring that pattern into conscious awareness, when you stop calling it laziness and start asking what it actually is, where it actually came from, what it was actually protecting you from, something changes at a level that discipline alone could never reach. Not overnight. Jung was never interested in overnight. He was interested in real. And what becomes real slowly is that you are not a lazy person who occasionally manages to function. You are a person carrying a set of jiggle-learned responses that were written in conditions that no longer exist. And learned responses, unlike character flaws, can be unlearned, not by force, by understanding, by bringing light to the part of you that has been operating in the dark for years, doing its best with what it knows. This is what integration means in Jungian psychology. Not fixing yourself, not overcoming yourself. Knowing yourself at the level where the patterns actually live. Because a pattern you can see is a pattern you can change. And a pattern you're calling laziness is one you'll carry forever. Most people never reach this part. You did. That already separates you from the version of yourself who started this video with that old word still sitting in their chest. That word has less weight now, And what comes next is what actually gives you somewhere to go with that. So where does this leave you? Not with a checklist, not with a morning routine, or a productivity system, or a set of rules to follow until motivation arrives. Jung wasn't interested in any of that. He was interested in something quieter and more permanent. He was interested in what happens when a person finally stops fighting the wrong battle, because that's what you've been doing for however long you've carried that word. You've been trying to defeat something you didn't understand, setting alarms to beat an enemy you couldn't name, building systems to outmaneuver a part of yourself you hadn't yet met. And systems built on misdiagnosis don't hold. Not because you're not disciplined enough to maintain them, because they were never aimed at the right thing. The shift Jung points you toward isn't a strategy. It's a reorientation, a different way of meeting yourself when the resistance comes. And it will come. It always comes. Instead of immediately reaching for the familiar verdict, lazy, weak, not enough. What if the next time you feel that wall go up, the heaviness, the avoidance, the sourceless inability to begin, you got curious instead of contemptuous? Not as a performance, not as a technique, as a genuine question. What is this protecting me from right now? What does this part of me believe will happen if I try? What did I learn somewhere early about what it means to fall short of my own expectations? You don't need to answer those questions perfectly. You don't need to trace every pattern back to its origin with clinical precision. Jung never asked that of anyone. What he asked was simpler and harder at the same time. Stop looking away. Stop reaching for the easy explanation. Sit with the discomfort of not knowing long enough for something more honest to emerge. That is the beginning of integration, not a dramatic transformation, a shift in how you hold yourself. A little less harshness, a little more curiosity. And over time, slowly, the way real things always move, the energy that was locked inside the pattern begins to free up. Not because you forced it, because you finally stopped fighting it. Think about what that actually means for the way you move through your days. The project that's been sitting, the version of your life you've been circling but never entering, the work that matters, the conversation that needs to happen, the beginning you keep clear's throat postponing. None of that was blocked by laziness. It was blocked by a part of you that needed to be understood before it would stand down. And understanding is something you now have access to that you didn't have at the start of this. Not as a concept, as something that belongs to you, something you can actually use. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, not the polished version, not the version that has it together and never wastes a day, the full version, the one that avoids and doubts and sometimes can't begin and has reasons for all of it that go deeper than character. That version accepted, not fixed, not managed. Accepted because acceptance, real acceptance, not resignation, is what removes the cost of suppression. When you stop spending energy hiding the parts of yourself that don't fit the person you think you should be, that energy comes back quietly, gradually available for the things you actually want to build. This is not a promise that the resistance disappears. It won't completely. The patterns that were written earliest run deepest, and they don't vanish because you understood them once, but they lose their authority. They become something you notice rather than something you become. And that distance, the small crucial space between you and the pattern, is where choice lives. You are not a lazy person. You were never a lazy person. You were a person who learned to stay still in conditions that made stillness the safest option. And then you grew up and the conditions changed, but the lesson stayed. Running in the background, dressed up as a personality trait, costing you more than you ever knew to calculate. That ends with understanding, not with a better system, not with more discipline, with seeing it clearly enough that it can no longer pretend to be the truth. This was never about becoming someone new. It was about returning to who you were before the word lazy ever had anything to do with you, before the pattern formed, before the lesson was written. To the version of you that wanted things without apology, that began things without armor, that didn't need to earn the right to try. That version of you didn't disappear. It just went quiet, and it's been waiting underneath everything for exactly this. If this reached you, it reached you for a reason. Drop a comment with the one thing that shifted. Not the whole video, just the one sentence that hit differently. That's where the real conversation starts.